Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our composer interview series for 2022-23 season. Our composer today is Leah Reid, who's also on staff at Boston New Music Initiative. She's a wonderful composer that does all kinds of stuff from acoustic to electronic things. She has done a lot of research in timbre and the parameters of timbre and how you can use that composing. I think she's going to talk a little bit about that today. And so we're super excited to have her. We'll start out, she's going to talk about her music and tell us some things, and then we'll have an opportunity. I'll ask her some questions about her music, and you all here will also have an opportunity to ask her questions at the end if you are interested. So without further ado, here is Leah Reid.
Great, thank you so much. And I'd like to start by thanking Beth for the invitation to speak with you today. Let me get my screen sharing going. Okay. Share sound. All right. Can I have a thumbs up that everyone can see my slide? Yeah, great. Okay. So as Beth said, my name is Leah Reid. I am an assistant professor of music composition at the University of Virginia and hold degrees from Stanford University and McGill University. I am also, as Beth mentioned, on staff at the Boston New Music Initiative. I am an artistic associate. So I am a composer of electronic, electroacoustic, and purely acoustic music. I also work in sound art, periodically design and augment instruments, and have a fascination with interactive sound installations. My work crosses a number of disciplines and incorporates music perception and cognition, electronics, literature, linguistics, and the visual arts. So today I'm going to start by talking about and playing an excerpt of my piece Reverie. Then I'm going to briefly outline my approach to composing with multidimensional timbre representations. We'll share a couple of examples, and of course we will have questions and talk. Okay, so Reverie is an acousmatic composition that leads the listener through an immersive fantasy centered around deconstructed music boxes. The work comprises 8 sections that alternate between explorations of the music box's gears and chimes. So in the work, the music box's sounds are pulled apart, exaggerated, expanded, and combined with other sounds whose timbres and textures are reminiscent of the original. So as the piece unfolds, the timbres increase in spectral and textural density, and the associations become more and more fantastical. So gears are transformed into zippers, coins, chainsaws, motorcycles, and fireworks. And the chimes morph into rainstorms, all sizes of bells, pianos, and quite a bit more. So I initially started this piece at the Cube at Virginia Tech, which you can see a picture of the space here on the slide. I composed a couple of miniatures using some of the materials for the space. I then picked these miniatures up again during 2 residencies at the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts and the Ucross Foundation. And many sounds from both of these locations can be found in the work. So I'm going to play for you a short segment of the piece, about a 2-minute clip from the work that can be found about a minute and a half into the piece. So my primary objective as a composer is to write beautiful and stimulating music. And for me, beauty is embodied by temporal and in particular timbral attributes. So the problem with timbre is that it's ill-defined. It's more often defined by what it isn't rather than what it actually is. So unlike pitch and loudness, there is no simple, objective, or single dimensional scale that describes this phenomenon. Timbre can, however, be described as a multidimensional attribute of sound, where continuous perceptual dimensions correlate with acoustic parameters corresponding to spectral, temporal, and spectrotemporal properties of sound events. So spectral meaning a snapshot of one point in time of the frequency components of a sound. Temporal meaning the changes in sound as it evolves in time. And spectrotemporal meaning how the spectrum of a sound varies over time. So as timbre became increasingly central in my composition, I adopted a hybrid model that integrates both the color and texture of sound and incorporates both static and dynamic attributes of timbre. So the color of sound is described in terms of an instantaneous snapshot of the spectral envelope, while the texture of sound describes the sequential changes in color with an arbitrary timescale. So this view of timbre was developed at Stanford University's Karma by Hiroko Terasawa and Jonathan Berger and hints at two important compositional elements in a piece: static vertical pitch and chordal structures, and dynamic horizontal temporal processes. So while these elements are important, this definition is still rather vague as to the descriptive factors of timbre. And for this, we must look at the various parameters of timbre and observe how they interact. So when looking at the parameters, we notice that the spectrum of the sound is critical, as are the individual frequencies, the way the sounds change over time, their amplitudes, and the way these components interact with each other. So these parameters begin to give one a better idea of what timbre actually is, but they still don't give a full view of how they interact. And this is where a spatial or geometric model of timbre is beneficial. So since timbre has no single dimensional scale that describes it, when one reviews the research completed on timbre, one is most likely dealing with a multi-dimensional space, or rather a timbre space. So a timbre space is a model that predicts the perceptual results of auditory stream information and timbral interval perception. So depending on the stimuli tested, different correlates are produced. So timbre space studies have used a variety of impulse sounds ranging from FM synthesized simulations to recorded instrumental tones. The aim of these models is to find robust descriptors that explain perceptual data across studies, to develop perceptually relevant acoustic distance models for measuring similarity objectively, and to find powerful descriptors for sound categorization and source identification. Now, there are many fantastic perceptual timbre models we're studying, including Pollard and Jensen, Gray, McAdams, and many others. However, they all have their limitations from a compositional perspective. So for example, these studies I just mentioned, they don't explain unpitched percussion or noise elements. From a composition viewpoint, there haven't been that many composers that have made timbre the primary concern in their music. And while the first composers that come to mind are from the spectral school, notably Grisset and Marais, the timbral systems of Penderecki, Spallinger, Sariaho, and Schaeffer have particularly fascinated me. So while I've been attracted to other composers and researchers' timbre models, for my own purposes, I've sought a model that both accounts for the way we perceive timbre and allows one to work with any sound or instrumentation. So when composing, I structure my works using 6 parameters that I organize into a set of 2 interlocking spaces or cubes, as I like to visualize them. The first cube essentially controls the frequency components of the sound. And this compositional timbre space has 3 dimensions: spectral flux, spectral centroid, and noise to pitch ratio. The first dimension, spectral flux, measures the Euclidean distance between 2 spectra, or rather the change of spectral energy over time. So in extension, this dimension can be used to control rhythms or the frequency of pitch changes. So for example, in my model, a sound with high flux means that there is a high rhythmic activity or that the pitches are changing quickly, while a sound with low flux would be one where there is either a low rhythmic activity or the pitches are stagnant. The second dimension controls the noise to pitch ratio, and is similar to Kaya Sariaho and Gerard Griset's timbral axis, which is a structuring device used to create tension and replace functional harmony in Sariaho's works. So on one end of the axis, we have sounds that are mostly pure pitch or sounds that are as close to sine waves as possible. And on the other end, we have mostly noise. The third dimension controls the spectral centroid, or rather the brightness and darkness of a sound. Now, this cube is missing some key information, so namely the quality of the attack, dynamics, and the length of the event entering into the first space. So to solve this dilemma, I use a secondary cube to inform these decisions. The second cube works in conjunction with the first part of the cube, and the first dimension, attack, controls how the sounds or gestures or articulations are treated, ranging from no attack or a smooth onset to a sharp attack or sharp onset. The second dimension controls the length of the event, sound, or gesture that enters into the first timbre cube. And the third dimension controls dynamics. In this model, each dimension scales depending on the source materials and the function of the desired result. So for example, one could use this model to learn more about a sound's timbral characteristics, or map a composition's instrumentation onto the space, creating spatial coordinates for every sound that you wish to use to see the possible relationships amongst them. So virtually any aspect of a composition can be viewed, and decisions can be made based on these two combined cubes. So you can use it to derive rhythms, generate a form, harmony, rate of material, or orchestration. And with this model, one can work with any sound or instrumentation. So one can use programs such as Sphere, AudioSculpt, OpenMusic, Orchids, Orchidea, or Bach, or many other Max objects and so on to analyze these parameters. Or one can work with the dimensions more intuitively. In either case, the model allows the perceptual properties of timbre to address many compositional elements across multiple dimensions. So to give you an example of how one might use these spaces in a composition, here's an example from my piece Ostia Tim for String Quartet. So the piece comprises a series of 15 fragments that explore the sounds produced by doors and the emotional inflections of people who interact with them. So in the piece, the spectral flux dimension controls the frequency and rhythm of pitch changes. The noise to pitch ratio controls bow and finger pressure. And the spectral centroid controls bow placement and mute usage. Cube 2 works as you'd expect it to, so attack controls the attack quality, ranging from crescendo dal niente to Bartok pits. The length of event ranges from short to long, and dynamics from niente to very loud. One could use the model to examine a static selection of parameters. So for example, fragment 1 in Ostia Tim is composed of small bursts of material with sharp onsets. So this point can be described as having a mid-spectral centroid, a mid-high noise to pitch ratio, and a mid-high spectral flux. Here's a recording for the first fragment. And the source material for that was doorbell chimes. So another possible use of the space is to explore moving trajectories in segments of material. So the second fragment exemplifies some of the possible trajectories that can be created in the space. And this fragment was derived from a door banging. So this fragment has two parts, measures 8 to 14 and measures 15 to 17. So in terms of articulations, the first part juxtaposes aggressive pizzicati with arco sounds, and the second part features delicate pizzicati and soft mid-noisy tremolos. Each part also has differing spectral flux coordinates. So the first part of the fragment has a high spectral flux, while the second part has a mid-low one. The spectral centroid has multiple trajectories, which you can see in the second violin and the cello. So for example, in measure 8, they move from the sul ponticello to ordinario, which can be viewed as a movement from a high spectral centroid to a mid spectral centroid. Another example can be seen in measure 12 with a movement back to sul ponticello, which can be viewed as a spectral centroid shift back to high. So in terms of the noise to pitch axis in measure 8, Both the second violin and the cello move from overpressured bowing to normale bowing. And this can be viewed on the timbre cube as a movement from a high noise to pitch ratio to a mid-low one. And the opposite can be seen again in measures 11 to 12 and 13 to 14. Here is the recording for the second fragment. So these principles can, of course, also be applied to larger structures in a piece as well. So my next example, Crumbs for Amplified Percussion and Electronics, explores delicate grains, sounds, and textures. The work was commissioned by Ensemble Mobile in Brazil as part of a miniatures project. So the work was designed to be portable, and all of the instruments and found objects in the live percussion can easily fit inside a small box. So the setup diagram for the piece is on the slide, which gives you an idea about the instrumentation. So you can see that we have 3 different types of bowls. We have a metal bowl, a glass bowl, a wood bowl, a couple different types of beans. We have plastic, a big plastic bag that's on the floor that the performer scrunches with their toes, parchment paper, fizzy water, wine glasses, other small handheld percussion. The performer also plays with the wood on the table, and so on. So the work begins with small, bright, effervescent grains and gradually incorporates larger, deeper, and more resonant textures. The work comprises 6 short sections, each examining a unique set of small handheld percussion instruments and common household items. So the work is centered around a 5-to-1 ratio, which controls the piece's proportions and the distribution of the number of attacks per section. So on the slide, we can see the proportions graphed. Each of the first 5 sections are composed of 2 gestures, one decelerating and one accelerating. The 6th section is divided into 5 additional parts that mirror the large-scale proportions in the piece. So on the slide, you can see the layout that I created in Logic detailing the structure. So I mathematically generate these points in Excel and OpenMusic. Then I used MIDI as markers both for the electronics and the score. So here is a score follower version of the work. Another way one can use the timbre model is to inform large-scale formal and structural elements of a piece. So for example, in my work Cloca for chamber ensemble, the piece was structured around this bell sound. So this bell resides in a historical meeting house in my hometown of Jaffrey Center, New Hampshire. So I began this piece by analyzing the bell's spectrum and spectral flux. I pulled out 37 of the bell's strongest partials and analyzed their decay. So I then reversed this sound, calculated out the timing of each partial, and then multiplied them by a factor of 7. The form of the piece consists of the retrograde of the bell sound, followed by the original bell sound. The piece is organized around vertical structuring points, which are the entrances of partials and other block materials. So the work begins with large blocks of materials derived from other bell and clock sounds. So examples of these other sounds are domestic clocks, fire alarms, wind chimes, school bells, car alarms, alarm clocks, and kitchen timers. So the first structuring partial is presented 2 minutes into the piece and appears to blend into the background. The blocks gradually become shorter and shorter as more bell partials are introduced. The partials become so frequent as they near the bell's attack that they completely overtake the material. So as I previously mentioned, the piece ends with a single iteration of the overarching bell sound. So this coda of sorts is the first time the listener hears all of the combined partials of the bell sound. So for each structural partial entrance in open music, I generate a series of spectra that move from the original bell's spectrum to a more and more distorted spectrum. The fundamental frequency of each spectrum gradually shifts down. So the original bell's partials function as center frequencies in the distorted spectrum. In the piece itself, each original partial is played as a held note, while the new spectral components are articulated through sweeping upward or downward gestures. So I'll play for you a 2-minute clip from measure 134 through the climax of the piece, which illustrates the structural bell sound and the juxtaposition of the blocks. My next example, Apple, illustrates one of my current projects exploring timbre and the voice. This work is for 4 sopranos. The work was commissioned by Accordant Commons, and the work was composed at MacDowell. So it explores the sounds and rhythms present inside Gertrude Stein's poem Apple from the Tender Buttons series. The work comprises 8 sections, each examining the poem or a subset of the text from a different angle. The first section explores the phoneme ap, the first part of the word apple and a normal singing style. The second section explores percussive, whispered, and spoken consonants from apple through shake. The third explores spoken Sprechstimme vowels from the beginning through please. The fourth explores half-sung syllables from the beginning through no gold. The fifth section explores spoken Sprechstimme and sung words and word clusters through change sweet is. The sixth section is the most melodious and explores bready through kind of with the melody, and the beginning through please and the accompaniment. The seventh section explores the entire poem, moving from whispered through half-sung textures, examining text from apple until ham. And the eighth section focuses on the final phrase, this is use. The work is highly theatrical, and the performers are directed to explore a vast repertoire of dramatic characters and singing styles. So the reason I put, timbre and the voice in a different category here is that when working with singers, in addition to working with the voice as an instrument, one also can consider the timbre of the text and theatrical inflections. While all of these elements come together in performance, these three timbral characteristics can be viewed and treated individually before being combined. So I will play for you the recording from the premiere performance with the commissioning ensemble. So another focus that is at the center of recent project is the concept of timbre in space. And I've explored this concept in acoustic, collaborative, and electronic works. So occupied spaces for two pianos and percussion originated through the idea of timbre in space and the topic of normalized echo density, or NED. So NED describes how the reflections of a sound in a given space interact over time and the texture that results. So for this piece, I used my model and the properties of NED to create spaces that I could insert impulses into. So through 6 sections in an introduction, the work explores timbre through a series of 11 spaces or rooms. So some of these spaces were either modeled after physically existing spaces, others were either imagined and don't follow the rules of physics, or they occur inside your head. So there are 3 impulses in the piece: a zipper, a clap, and a balloon pop that are inserted into these rooms. And the sounds are filtered to various degrees, and over the course of the piece, frequencies are added to the impulses, creating an increasingly noisy texture. So here are the original analyses of the rooms. So essentially, this is what happens when a 16th note B4 is inserted into the spaces. So pitches are altered, orchestration is informed, and rhythms are generated. So for example, a single pitch could be transformed into this, 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 or one of 7 other options. So expanding from this idea of timbre in space includes working with spatialization, multi-channel music, and space as a parameter. So each time I write a piece, I look for new ways to explore my compositional timbre model. So as such, my portfolio illustrates a trajectory through which composing with timbre yielded new creative insights and compositional techniques. And with this model, each of my compositions serve as a piece of a puzzle whose image reveals a more clear and complete understanding of timbre. If you'd like to know more, additional information, recordings, scores, so on, and are available on my website at leahreidmusic.com and on SoundCloud. I also have a recent article published in Leonardo titled "Composing with Multidimensional Timbre Representations" that more thoroughly outlines my approach through 2 instrumental compositions. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, let me know.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Leah. Let's do, all right. We are going to, okay, I'm going to stop sharing. There we go.
Great.
And, let's see, looking at the time. So if anyone does have questions, I'll open it up to questions right now if anybody has any. Okay. Well, feel free to jump in. Oh, is there questions?
Hi. How could you describe a little bit more about the rooms and occupied spaces, specifically the imaginary ones?
Sure. Yeah. Let me go back to it. Beth, do you mind if I share my screen again?
Go for it again. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
There you go.
There we go. So in occupied spaces, so essentially what I did is I created a model for each of the different rooms that I wanted to be working with. So like, for example, sometimes it was taking impulse responses from the various rooms. Sometimes it was sort of imagining different spaces that, and then sort of applying additional processes to that. And so I created a model for all these different things. And then I inserted these impulses and sort of created these. These are sort of the quantified results of what results from those spaces. So ones that don't follow the rules of physics are, for example, like a space that has, you put the impulse into it and it like chromatically like creates all these different like clusters and steps it up. There's no actual space that would create a scale moving upward. But in my world, I thought that was an interesting gesture. And I thought that would be cool if a space could do that. Something that happens inside your head, obviously there's no interaction at all. Then it would be there's no reaction in the space of the room in general. So there's nothing that gets affected and so on.
Well, yeah. Super cool. All right. Any other questions? Taiba.
Yeah, I was wondering, sort of based on that, do you find then that the performance venue for when your pieces are played or if they're re-performed is sort of something that you consider sort of for the premiere? And how do you find other sort of ensembles playing them? Sort of changes it when you get the same piece done in a different space?
I mean, absolutely. And it sort of depends, a lot with, especially with my acousmatic pieces. I definitely think that the space has a huge component. You're playing the space. And so I design a lot of the pieces to specifically interact. How would they be performed and how can you change that? So when I take those and I tour with those pieces, it's very much so if I'm sitting at the console and I'm diffusing my works into those spaces, it's very much considering the acoustic parameters of the different environments that I'm in. And so for the piece that I played for you a little bit at the beginning, Reverie, the piece at the very end, it's spatialized, it's 8 channels, and there's fireworks that happen at the end, and you can get the entire, if you just get the right level of, the subwoofer with the things, it feels like you're at a fireworks display. You can get every seat rumbling. You can sort of have that feeling coming through the floor with it. And so, and some of my other pieces I didn't play for you today. Sketch is another of my acousmatic works. I have stereo 4 to 8 channel surround, an ambisonics version for 32 channels, a wave field synthesis version, and I designed them each for the specific spaces. And so, really playing with the room, it can, and how you're experiencing that is a huge part that I think a lot about with my works, both with, the chamber pieces, but definitely with the electronic pieces.
Any other questions right now? All right. I'm gonna ask just a couple. I'm gonna start with more. So I'm fascinated, Leah, how did you start? Like, what instrument did you start on? Or like, how did you get into music?
I started with violin as a child. I think a lot of, kids, I saw a string quartet come into my classroom when I was 5, and I was like, I want to do that. And so my parents were supportive. I started singing opera when I was a kid too, and I went to performing arts high school for composition and opera performance, and was trying to also play piano and voice, but eventually you have to kind of down select with what you're good at. And so the overall the composition, the voice won out for a long time. And then it's I love composing for voice. I don't love performing and singing for other people. So yeah, I like performing with electronics. That's fine.
Yeah, I was just curious. So then actually, were your parents musicians or no? You just got interested?
No, they're both visual artists, but my there's a love of music and of the arts in general that run in the family. My dad, he always was really interested in all styles, and so he would play for me tons of different styles of music. And I was, exposed to a lot, and I would listen to things and try to mimic it and sit, and still has an encyclopedic knowledge of musical styles, which still really just amazes me. So yeah.
Super cool. So yeah, another question I had, oh yes. So yeah, you said, I noticed, so it looks like most of you're been more interested in writing for voice maybe recently. I might be wrong about that, but I find it fascinating. You kind of mentioned it when you talked about Apple, just like how much the human voice has so many different parameters of timbre. And so one thing I was actually, so this kind of it's a little bit related to Tybell's question, which is, do you think about because each human voice has its own timbre, and do you ever think about that and the timbres of specific performers, and or that it might be really different when performed with other voices?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of questions in that. Let me unpack it a little bit. Yes. So actually, with composing for voice, I composed quite a few vocal pieces. My first composition when I was a kid was for the voice. I mean, I love the voice. I composed quite a few more because I was classically trained, it tended to be sort of, I had a hard time breaking away from that. So a lot of my early vocal pieces were still, sort of, more geared towards that style. And so during my doctorate, and I avoided composing. I only composed really one piece for the voice, and I sort of avoided really trying to figure out how I would be using my compositional model to approach the complicated avenue of composing for the voice. And mainly it's because of what you're saying. Each person's, voice is different. The text is imbued with timbral material. You can alter your voice so easily with just giving a theatrical sort of indication in the score, or, you can change the timbre with keeping the same text. And so there's so many elements that can, from a timbral perspective, that can be treated, that to fully explore it, it just becomes complicated, right? And so it took me a couple of years to really figure out how to approach my model and to keep all of these parameters without overcomplicating it. If I couldn't do it, I didn't want to have anyone else. I didn't want to hand a score to anyone else. And so it took a couple of years. I rewrote, I think, Apple, 4 or 5 times. And then I set it aside for a while. I wrote a different piece called Single Fish. Then I came back and rewrote this one, and it was much simpler. And what I ended up doing is for these pieces, I create sort of a fixed media version where I perform everything and create an acousmatic piece for it, and then I transcribe everything.
Wow, that sounds like very intense. Cool. What was the other thing that I was going to ask you about was the piece was bells. I feel like there's a lot of your pieces that are just like have bells and bell-like sounds and like playing with bells. Is there something about that?
Bells are so cool. There's, I mean, they just the timbral characteristics, the structure of them, they're so, each one is a little bit different. Yeah, I do have a piece called Ring, Resonate, Resound, which is based on 37 different bells. And my piece Sparrow Sparrow is dealing with bells. And I mean, there's so much material there that's really interesting. And each bell has a different spectral structure, the timings of that you can, zoom into the different sounds. And there's just a ton of material there. So I think, like many composers, I've been fascinated with that. And then some of my work, like with Ring, Resonate, Resound, that piece was commissioned was written specifically for a concert featuring, John Chowning and Jean-Claude Risset's works, which are also known for some of these, the pioneers with FM synthesis and exploring some of these similar type of timbres and electroacoustic music. So paying homage to them as well.
Yeah, that was a really cool piece. I listened to that one, and I also listened to Sparrow, which I really, really enjoyed. One of the things about Sparrow that I liked, and maybe if I was able to hear it in a bigger room too, like there's just so much blending where sometimes you couldn't tell what instrument it was or whether it was the electronics or an instrument. And it was a really, really cool.
Well, thank you. That's something that I really try to have, is that the line should, in my pieces, I like to have the line be a little bit blurred between what's happening. And I've gotten for Crumbs, I've gotten, one of the reviews was like, it's an impossible performance because, you can't tell exactly what the performer is doing and what's coming from the electronics, even in real life. You have the visual cues, but you still have a hard time. It just sort of seems like an impossible performance in the end, because it's just, like they have 10 hands or something.
Actually, that reminds me. So another thing that I was appreciating in the music, what you're saying, like, is the inclusion of degrees of randomness, like things that are like decisions of performers. There's a lot of music that obviously is very carefully controlled, but then almost every one of the pieces that I said has some element in there of randomness or, variation having to do that you allow the performer, which I I think is smart because it makes it different every time. And it also, I don't know, there's something about, as a performer trying to be too exact all the time, the whole time.
Well,
If it-
I think that, I mean, that's exactly it. I mean, I think if I want something exactly performed exactly the same way each time, I'm gonna make it fixed media, or I'm gonna make it so that it's exactly the same each time. That variability is so beautiful. And that's, I want the performers to shine through. I want them to engage with the pieces, put their own stamp on it. I don't think, it's my pieces are designed so that they can, they'll sound different each time. And that's wonderful. And that's my favorite part. I love hearing that. And when I don't want that, then that's, then they're just my thing, and that's my performance of it. And that's the fixed media, and it's the same each time.
Right. Yeah. But it's good to have a distinction too, and to know that. Yeah. So that's so cool. Okay. I'm gonna open up any last questions. I didn't see any anywhere, but if anybody has any last questions, now is the time. Okay. So thanks again so much, Leah. I was gonna say our next composer interview is with Osnat Netzer, sorry. And she is we are going to be interviewing her on December 8th. So check out our website for tickets. I think that's it. So again, thanks so much for sharing, Leah. It was really interesting, very exciting. Great.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for